In the last film, I was talking to you about out-of-planet transits. For this second film, I'm concentrating on the transits of Jupiter and Saturn, and also looking at some philosophical issues, of which there are a lot if you're doing astrology, and particularly if you're doing forecasting. And also looking at what you might call as generic cycles, cyclical cycles, cycles that everybody gets, like their Saturn return at the age of 29 and 58 and so on. So that's what we're going to be doing today. Just thinking about the Jupiter transit, for example. Jupiter moves fairly fast, has a 12-year cycle, as many of you will know, well, slightly less than 12 years. So it spends a year in a sign. And if it makes aspect to one of your planets, it may only stay there for a few days, depending. Sometimes it will be quite slow and sit on whatever the position is for a longer period of time, which is kind of fortunate, really. Anyway, Jupiter expands what it touches. That's the main issue. It enlarges, it expands what it touches, generally inflates what it touches. Now, this isn't always good news because it depends what is being enlarged. And I'm fond of saying that astrologers project onto the planets the nature of the planets. So they're terrified of Pluto transits, frightened of Saturn ones, and tremendously optimistic about Jupiter transits. So we tend to exaggerate the benefits of Jupiter, and Jupiter is the planet of exaggeration. So I suppose what I'm trying to say to you is that if there is a problematical issue in your horoscope, then Jupiter can exaggerate that. For example, say you have a very accident-prone Mars, Uranus, Moon, Sun kind of configuration in your chart, then a transit from Jupiter could be one of the things to kick it off. But that's not what usually happens. Usually we associate Jupiter with all things beneficial. It is certainly the planet that triggers travel. So, transiting Jupiter on your ascendant might mean you go for a long trip, or on your Sun, or on your Moon, anywhere really. So Jupiter can trigger travel, education, long journeys of a physical or a more mental nature. And Jupiter really helps us feel more positive, more confident. Jupiter is a planet of release and relief and protection and luck. So it's true, we are often lucky in the area that Jupiter is transiting. So maybe Jupiter's going through your 6th house and you're trying to get a job, or through your 10th, the area of your career. Well, Jupiter going through those houses is undoubtedly good news. Whereas Saturn, which we'll talk about later, may be rather less so. Jupiter just makes one feel buoyant, confident, good. And sometimes you have the notion of some kind of happy release. I remember this idea of releasing and exaggerating things can be quite useful. I remember years ago, and I just had a bad back for months, years really, and I can't remember what the Jupiter transit was, but it became much worse. But somebody I knew said to me, why don't you go to ... a cranial osteopath, who I did go to, and he miraculously transformed it after years of me going to every alternative practitioner in London virtually. So there's something sometimes about the idea of something being enlarged that makes you see it. And there is this feeling of release that often comes with Jupiter. The idea of release, you'll be surprised how often Jupiter going over the midheaven coincides with the death of a parent, not on its own. You'll have to have the more usual Pluto square Sun or moon or whatever it is. But the faster moving Jupiter is a trigger. And if you remember that the MC is a planet to associate with parents, it can be the idea that your parent is going on a long journey, or the parent is going to meet their god. If you think of Jupiter as a planet to associate with beliefs, meaning, religion, and one's own particular image of God. It's also, for some members of the family, a promotion, because Jupiter transiting the midheaven is the kind of time that you get promoted. So if you're promoted to head of family, whatever else grief is going on, that is within the symbolism. So as always, you have to look at what else is going on. Jupiter is, of course, the planet of growth. We've said it's about enlargement. That also includes putting on weight. Jupiter is famous for going over the ascendant and everybody putting on weight. And it can be growth in terms of growths too, sometimes, which is less obviously a positive manifestation, but weight gain anyway. And now I think I want to go on to Saturn, really. I think Jupiter transits are fairly obvious, but people get frightened of their Saturn transits, and I don't think you should really. But what a Saturn transit is, it's a reality transit, and how you experience it will depend on where you are on the whole reality stakes with respect to what planet or house is being picked up by Saturn. As you'll know, it has a 29-year cycle, so it spends 2.5 years in a sign, or roughly a house. And so one is usually brought down to Earth with respect to wherever Jupiter is travelling. Usually we associate Saturn with duties and responsibilities, and it can bring those. For example, Saturn is usually very prominent during the birth of the first child. It's a huge sense of responsibility that you've not had before. Invariably, wherever Saturn is transiting, we feel tested. And it's actually a good time for taking exams on some levels. I had a client recently who she's a doctor, and she was taking exams to become an anaesthetist, and she kept failing one of the exams. And the first time she failed it, I noticed that Saturn was conjunct her Mercury. And 6 months later, she had an opportunity to take the exam again. And she said to me, "Is it a good time?" I just told her to sit the exam anyway. And then she failed it again. Saturn was back on the Mercury. And then at the end of the year, she retook it and passed it. But I suppose my way of thinking about it is that she wouldn't have passed if she hadn't been putting the work in during the year. So, but Saturn is a good time for exams, including things like drive-in tests. A drive-in test is a test of one's ability to control a vehicle. And we know that Saturn is about control and boundaries and all the things you know about Saturn generally, really. So it's a good time to consciously get yourself tested in some way. So transiting Saturn, picking up your Mercury, maybe somebody or something in the outside world will question your knowledge, question your opinions. Well, if you can look at that as a positive, as the idea of, oh, well, maybe I should look at that differently. If you could look at it in a positive way, that would help somewhat. And Saturn is a planet that always insists on definition. So whatever planet is being touched, this is a time, psychologically at least, to define what that planet means. So Saturn to Mercury, really define what you think and you say, with more care and less carelessness. Saturn to Venus can be a time when you may feel a bit lonely. It may not be the best time for your love life or your money or anything else that you associate with Venus. But at the same time, it's a time to really define what you mean by love. What do you mean by affection? What do these things mean to you? And if it's taking a more financial stance, well then what things do you really value? Define them. And Saturn always wants us to trim, to contract. It's the opposite of Jupiter, which is about exaggeration. Saturn is about contraction. So Saturn to your Venus is a good time to, well, contract your spending, to spend less, to take your financial situation more seriously. Another key word for Saturn, to take things seriously. Of course, one of the reasons why most of us don't look forward to Saturn transits is because we can associate them with delays. Things do get delayed under Saturn transits. And I think it's the astrologer Robert Hand who says, well, in those delays, it's an opportunity to see, do I really want whatever the thing is? So again, you're being tested in some ways. Do I really want this thing that I think I want? So your goals are being tested. So there's a time, Saturn transits are times of doubt, times of ought I, should I, am I good enough? The opposite of Jupiter. So we don't get away with things with Saturn. You reap what you sow. So if you were taking an exam, you will only pass it if you know your stuff. You won't get away with a flaky answer. So with Saturn, it's always best to apply some self-discipline, self-reliance, self-control. That's what Saturn always calls for. And how one experiences a Saturn transit, of course, is partly what planet is being picked up and how comfortable one is with Saturn and with reality. But the more painful Saturn transits are usually the emotional ones. So Saturn to the Moon, for example, Saturn to Venus. But Saturn to the Moon is a kind of time, for example, when you have to be more emotionally self-sufficient. It's the kind of time when nobody's available, particularly women. None of the women in your life, none of the mother figures in your life are there. They're too busy, they're working, they're absent for whatever reason. Not for any bad or rude sort of reason. It's just the cosmos is sort of forcing you to be on your own, to be, as I say, emotionally self-sufficient. So, and Saturn transits, whatever your age, are always a maturing process. And one is always aware of age and the aging process under Saturn transits. And that would even be the case if you're just 18. So it is the time to really apply yourself. It is the time to put in hard work. You can get your just rewards with Saturn, but you have to put the work in. For example, a woman I know who is, or at least was, an actress, she, like many people in the acting profession, she spent a lot of her time out of work. And on this particular occasion, she had transits from Jupiter and Uranus to planets in her 5th house of acting. And she got the lead role in a West End musical, which is, hey, amazing. It's the stuff of Jupiter and Uranus. Unexpected luck. It was amazing. But actually, the musical flopped. I think it closed down after about 6 or 8 weeks. Whereas, if she had have got the part under a Saturn transit to the same planets, she would have got a smaller part, probably, not the lead, but it would have lasted for a much longer time. So time is inevitably an issue with Saturn. You know, there's never enough time over a job or never enough time in one's life. There are more pulls on one's time. And as I said before, one's doubts, one's fears, one's oughts, one's shoulds come to the fore. Guilt also. Issues to do with your father, or being a father, or becoming a parent, or taking on responsibilities. The other thing about the first child and Saturn here, one's time becomes much more limited, one's freedom becomes limited, one's life becomes contracted. It's just you and the baby kind of thing. So it is a time for responsibilities, for duties, sometimes for burdens and more hard work if you're in work. But it's not huge. Jupiter and Saturn are the transits of everyday life, the transits of the peaks and troughs of everyday life. It's not like outer planet activity, which is the kind of stuff that changes your life forever, that you know your life will never be the same, that you'll say, yeah, in 1988 such and such happened. Jupiter and Saturn aren't like that. They're just the ups and downs of everyday life. What is interesting is when they accompany some of the stuff from the outer planets. I'll give you some examples, actually, of transits, how we always expect the worst, but nevertheless, that's not what necessarily happens. I'm showing you another slide here now. And this slide just shows two planets from my own chart, and I have Sun square Saturn, Sun at 10 of Aquarius, square Saturn at 9 of Scorpio. And some years ago, I was due to go on holiday. There's a gang of friends in South London, and I'm one of them. And we tend to do something around each person's birthday, if they have a big birthday. And we were discussing the birthday of somebody whose birthday was to be in November, and we were discussing it in March or April. And this woman, Janet, wanted us all to go to Morocco, which was rather more extravagant than what we normally do. But anyway, she was very insistent, so we felt we had to go to Morocco. And I looked ahead to the transits in November, and I thought, oh dear, I'm going to have Saturn. I'll show you the new slide here. This is the 1st of November in 2005, and the whole event was the first week or so of November. And Saturn in the sky was at 10 of Leo. You can see the red arrow there. Saturn was opposing my Sun and squaring itself. So I thought, ooh, this is not a great time to go on holiday, is it? Anyway, around this time, I had a client who I'd got kind of friendly with. And she wanted me to go to Burghley House. And here's a picture of Burghley House here. And I can't remember why she wanted me to go, but she thought it was a lovely stately home, and we went and, spent a few hours there. Anyway, then the whole Morocco issue came up. And there was 6, 8 of us going, and myself and another friend, we were going later. Some of them were going for 2 weeks, and myself and one particular friend were going for the second week. Anyway, the night before we were due to fly, my friend discovered that her passport had expired. So we had to go to the passport office and get a new passport, and we missed our flight, and we had to get a later flight. I hope you're starting to hear Saturn here. We had to get a later flight. There was a delay, and it was an expensive delay too. And it was very cold. It was cold here, and I had to get jumpers and stuff and so on. Anyway, eventually got to Marrakesh in Morocco. And on the way, I was reading a book at the time, which was set in Edinburgh. So the same letters as Burghley, Edinburgh, B-U-R-G-H. I hope this doesn't get lost in translation. But anyway, I was reading this book set in Edinburgh. Anyway, we got to Morocco, and we had a very nice holiday. It was very cold. So Saturn is always cold. We all ended up wearing all our clothes all the time. Should be quite warm, but it was uncharacteristically cold. The Marrakesh is a walled city, so there's walls right the way around the city. And I came to understand that Burgh, B-U-R-G-H, as in Edinburgh, as in Burley, Burgh means walled city. I was having Saturn transits, and here I was, everything to do with a walled city. Marrakesh, Morocco, is not a rich country. So everywhere you went, you saw people carrying stuff with their donkeys. Beasts of burden has a Saturnian feeling about it. A general feeling of poverty was there. This is my Saturn transit. We spent one day up in the Atlas Mountains. You'll remember that Atlas carried the world on his shoulders. So it's the idea of heaviness, the gravitas of the situation. So I hope you can see from this that transits work out in many different ways, and it's a lot to do with consciousness, listening. Because you could have had all this stuff with Edinburgh and Burley House and being in Marrakesh and not actually noticed. And as a person, I'm a fairly one-to-one person, so I was with a group of friends, and they're not my closest friends. They're friends, we've known each other for years, all of us, but they're not my closest friends. And so to actually spend a week, it's not necessarily my idea of fun, really. And Saturn is about walls, as we've discovered. Walls, literally walls and boundaries. Really, perhaps what the gods were asking of me is to take some of my own personal walls down, because walls protect us, but they also keep people out. So maybe that was the lesson. Anyway, coming back on the flight, I had in those days you had things called MP3 players. Can't even remember what they looked like. But I spilt a drink. I spilt a drink onto my book set in Edinburgh, and I damaged my MP3 player. I can't remember the exact details. So you might remember that Saturn is in Scorpio in my chart, water sign. Anyway, I came back, I sorted out the MP3, and by accident, here's the next slide, by complete accident, I downloaded a record by Christa Berg, B-U-R-G-H, and here is the picture of him. So that's the kind of things that happen with transit. So I suppose my advice to you is to be much looser about how you keep to the essence of what the transit or direction or progression, when we get onto those, keep to the essence of what they're about. But exactly what will happen, you're not going to get it. There's always a gremlin in the works. I'll give you another example. Here's my chart again with the same Sun Saturn. And I can't remember when it was, but I was going, again on holiday, to a place called Hay-on-Wye. It's a little town between England and Wales. And it's famous in the UK for selling books, second-hand books. And anyway, myself and a friend were going in my slightly dodgy car of the moment to spend some time in a very rural location outside this town. And there was an eclipse that fell exactly on my Saturn in Scorpio. And it rained, and it rained, and it rained. And to get to the house, which we rented for the week, I had to drive through a ford. So a dip in the road where there's water, and there's always water there, but there'd been so much rain, the water was quite deep. They always tell you to check your brakes after driving through a ford. Be that as it may, the car, which was a bit dodgy anyway, became sick. The brakes I did have problems with, but I had problems with the car anyway. You'll notice that my Saturn's in the third house of transport, the house of getting from A to B. So the Saturn, in some sense, was my car. And of course I was going very near a town that sells books, something else you'd associate with the third house. I'm obsessed with books and second-hand books anyway. But you may be actually interested in the book that I was reading on that holiday. That's called the, I just wonder whether I did no, I didn't do a picture of it. It was called The Alchemist, by, some of you may know it, by Paulo Coelho. And the alchemy, you may remember, not so much about the book, but alchemy is about turning lead into gold. Now the sun, as you will all know, we associate with gold, and Saturn, the metal we associate with Saturn, is lead. So here it was, even describes the fact of The Alchemist, which was a book that I was very moved by at the time. So when you're working with your triumphs, try and be much more conscious with your process, even what books you're reading, what films you go to see, what conversations you have. That's the stuff of Jupiter and Saturn. Now, of course, we can have transits from, and do all the time, from Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus and Mars. And these and if you have time, watch them on a daily basis. And see, I mean, the day you go to the hairdresser, well, your hair may be being cut. That sounds like Mars. So what is Mars doing in your chart? Or maybe it's something to do with beauty, so that's a Venus thing. It depends how often you go to the hairdresser. If you go to the hairdresser all the time, it is less likely to show in your horoscope. Venus would also be, maybe on your ascendant, or picking up something when you go to an art gallery, for example, or a transit to your Neptune if you go to the cinema. But again, less so if you go to the cinema all the time. Mercury, what letters you write and receive. Again, that's slightly less now with digital communication when we're having emails all the time. But you can kind of watch these things. When I was first into astrology, I was living in the West Indies and in Canada. It's a long story. But I often was waiting for checks or letters from people, and I could virtually predict when I would receive these, just watching the transiting moon. The transiting moon, of course, goes right round the chart every month. So the transiting moon perhaps going through my 9th or the 3rd, that was the kind of time that I might associate with communication from overseas. It didn't always happen, of course, but the more you watch these things, the more you see. And the beauty, of course, of astrology is that it is very jokey, as in the book The Alchemist. And it offers you a real opportunity. It offers us all an opportunity for greater self-awareness. I think sometimes you have to have time off, but it does offer that opportunity. But you will find it quite difficult always to predict what's going to happen for yourself or for somebody else. There are exceptions to that, and I'll go on to those with this film and other films. Okay, what I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about the more generic cycles, and in particular the Saturn Return. Okay, so the Saturn Return occurs when we're about 29, and again at 58, and then at 86, 87, something like that. So every 29 years, Saturn returns to its natal place. And in between times, it also regularly squares itself and opposes itself. So your first square is when you're 7, then the first opposition when you're 14, and then when you're 21, you'll have the second square. So squares when we're 7, 21, 35, 49, 42, and it opposes itself when we're 14, 43, 72, that kind of thing. Here's a chart for Barack Obama, and you'll see that he has his natal Saturn in the 12th house at 25 of Capricorn. So his Saturn would have squared his natal square when he was 7, when it was at 25 of Aries. Saturn would have opposed his natal Saturn when he was 14, when Saturn was at 25 of Cancer. And when he was 21, Saturn would have been at 25 of Libra, again squaring itself. So this is his first Saturn return. This is the day it's exact, on the 1st of May 1990, when he was 28 years and 9 months. One of the things to say about the Saturn return, and this applies to a lot of transits, and particularly new moons and full moons and eclipses, is that the event happens sometimes before exactitude. So from about the age of 24, 25, the Saturn return is working. It's a bit like turning a kettle on. At the Saturn return, in this case 28 years, 9 months, the kettle has boiled. And the events actually occur years before. And in fact, I'm sure if you looked at what was happening to Barack Obama on this day, or this month, or even this year, the year of 1990, you may not have discovered that very much particularly was going on. It had already happened. So what does happen with the Saturn return? Well, I suppose the first thing to think of is that Saturn will have gone through every house in your horoscope, and it will have made every conceivable aspect to every planet in your chart. So Saturn coming back to itself should imply a certain maturity. Certainly a Saturn return offers an opportunity to cut the cord with your parents. It all depends on what's gone before, but decisions that you made in your late teens and early 20s will nearly always have to go through some kind of revision of the contract, shall we say. So it can be a time when there's a choice of vocation. You know, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? Or you may be well on the way to your vocation. And sometimes it's a period of crisis, you know, because of the fact that outmoded aspects of childhood have to go. So there can be a switch in what you want. And relationships formed before your Saturn return will have to, as I say, have a revision of the contract. Perhaps you married young, perhaps you married when you were 18 or 21. This does not mean that your marriage at this point will fall apart, but it does mean that your mature selves will shift things in some way. It can be a time of settling down, of putting down roots, of laying down the foundations for the rest of your life. A psychologist, well, I'm not sure whether she's a psychologist, but a writer called Gail Sheehy, who talked about different times of life, not from an astrological point of view, just noticing that people do things, we all do things at different times of life. She describes this as the period of rearranging the furniture in one's life. So, of course, one's partly interested in where is your Saturn. Now, for Barack Obama, well, I can't remember too much what he did, but I think one of the things that was going on for him, which he talks about in his biographies, is that he was tracing the paternal line, the fathers in his family. He's got Saturn in the 12th house. His father was behind the scenes. The 12th house is the house of what is behind me. So he was finding out, and I think he actually found his father at this point. And his father had various issues, drinking problems apart from anything else. He lost both his legs in accidents. Saturn is in the 12th house, the Pisces house, the house you might associate with alcohol and legs. Not that everybody with Saturn in the 12th has an alcoholic father with missing legs. He lost his legs in various car accidents under the influence of alcohol, if I remember rightly. But each of us will have Saturn somewhere else. If you have Saturn in the 4th house, maybe this is the time when you make a serious house move, maybe buy your own house for the first time. Saturn in the 7th, the house of marriage, perhaps you do, in fact, enter into a contract with somebody, so like a marriage contract. Or if you're already married, it can mean that you do that, but also that you exit from a previous marriage. People with Saturn in the 7th are often very frightened of not settling down with somebody, and they're also very frightened of settling down with somebody. So it's the kind of period that one would have to work something out. Now you notice from previous slides that I had Saturn in the 3rd house of school. And in fact, I'd left school at a very young age with no qualifications. So for my Saturn return, I went back and got a degree and did all the things that, people do. But with my Saturn in the 3rd house, I felt I didn't have any bits of paper and I had a bit of an inferiority complex about it. So you have to look at where your particular Saturn is. But the main thing about it is that the first Saturn return is very much a gateway of maturity. Now there's the second Saturn return, which Obama will get in 2020 when he'll be 58. The second Saturn return, I think one of the issues of this time is an awareness of the generation that one belongs to, and correspondingly an awareness of all the generations that one doesn't belong to. The realization dawns really, and I'm grateful to an astrologer called Darby Costello here for making this observation really. The realization dawns really that in terms of the fashion industry or the music industry or any cultural fashions of the times, that one is no longer the target audience. After all, when someone writes a pop song, the writer doesn't have their parents' generation in mind. They have their own generation in mind. In one's mid and late 50s and beyond, the individual is no longer in the bubble which is the mainstream of society's consciousness. Instead, we are inhabiting a different bubble which is slightly off-centre. We're travelling along a B road when consensus society is speeding along the motorway. And if you're at this time of life, you find that people younger than you are doing what used to be your job. You'll remember that in mythology, Kronos, the Greek god you associate with Saturn, he ate his children. And this is what the myth means, really. It's something about the older generation trying to nip the younger generation in the bud, so to speak. I want to finish this by talking about a few philosophical issues. What we're doing and philosophical matters are huge when you think about astrology, and particularly when you consider forecasting. We're fond of saying that the natal chart is a map of potential. And when we're using transits, directions and progressions, don't worry if you don't know what they are yet, but when we're using the various forecasting techniques, we're watching latent potential become manifest in a way. And there's a few things to think about. When you can forget astrology for a minute. If you have a newborn baby, on some level you could say that the baby is all potential. Astrologers would say, well, there's a map there. The potential isn't endless, but there is substantial potential. But as we grow up, as the child grows up, there is less potential and more actuality. It's a bit like having a sheet of paper. I remember when I was a kid at school in an art class, you were given a piece of paper and you were told to paint or draw something. And it used to take me ages to start because, well, times were hard. You wasn't sure you were going to get a second piece of paper. So I was frightened to draw anything on the piece of paper because that was it. And life is like that too. If you train as a brain surgeon, you're less likely, you've drawn on the page of paper, you're a brain surgeon. There's less room to, I don't know, take up Olympic skiing or something. In a similar way, the younger you are, what happens to you is kind of larger. When you see the baby throw their ice cream, well, I guess a baby wouldn't be eating an ice cream, a toddler throws the ice cream out of the pram and screams as if it's the end of the world. Well, to the child, it is the end of the world. Similarly, just to use a different analogy, the astrologer Liz Green, who you may be familiar with, will say that an acorn can only grow into an oak tree, which is what we're studying. Is your horoscope the horoscope of an oak tree or a sycamore or an apple tree or a cherry tree or what? So the acorn can only grow into an oak tree, and with forecasting, we're watching it grow. But imagine that you have a young sapling and, the tree is very young, and a child comes along with a penknife and slashes the tree. Now, it doesn't kill the tree, fortunately. Well, as the tree grows 30 years, 40 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, the scar, the gash, will grow with the trunk, with the tree. So you might go and revisit the tree 50 years later and the child would actually be able to see a scar on the tree. This is rather like life. If you're abused when you're young, whatever goes wrong when you're young, it grows with you. But imagine a child with the same penknife, with the same use of force, makes the same gash to a huge adult tree. You would be hard-pressed the next day to actually find where the cut had been made. So there's a lot to think about. Common sense, really. But one has to think of common sense in terms of forecasting. How old is somebody? What is the context here? Where do they live? What are the opportunities? I mean, would you look at transits the same for, the Queen, the head of the nation, who has presumably access to tremendous amounts of money to deal with things, huge resources in terms of people, places and finances? Would you interpret a given transit exactly the same if somebody was born in a refugee camp somewhere and undergoing the same transit? In a similar way, if you're very, very elderly, a transit that might not be dangerous when you're 30 could be when you're 90. And the same transit when you're 3 months old might be more worrying too. So always have kind of context in mind when you're thinking in terms of forecasting. Another word for forecasting is prophecy, and in a sense that is what we're involved with. And prophecy used to be part of the religious function. It still is in parts of the world, and perhaps it still should be. I believe that we should be less trying to predict what will happen and much more about interpreting what is happening. Sometimes you can predict that. Anyway, let's think of a few more philosophical issues here. what most people want to know, what many of you watching this film will say, what will happen? People come with the question, what will happen? And it's $100 million question. Can the astrologer answer that? And a lot of the time, I would say we can't. But and I'll explain why in a minute. But there are other questions. When will it happen? Where will it happen? And why is this happening? Now, these later questions, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail in a minute, but these later questions are easier to answer. When will it happen? We can often do timing. Where will it happen? Well, theoretically we can do where, but in practice it's quite hard. But why is this happening? Well, we can certainly have a conversation with whoever we're talking to, and using the symbolism of the planets, have a conversation with them so that they will perhaps be able to glean some meaning from whatever it is that is happening. People actually come to astrologers when they sense change is in the air. It's a bit like the old American cowboy movies, which are rather politically incorrect, but used to have the cowboys and the Indians, and they used to do battle with each other. And sometimes in these films you would see the Indian talking to the white man, and the Indian would put his head to the ground and he would be able to hear the train, the iron horse as it was called. He could hear it. Nobody could see the train, nobody else could hear it, but he could hear it. And people go to astrologers really when in some sense they're hearing the train. So the other question is, in terms of what will happen, is will it be good or bad? And this is a huge question, but in some sense you have to, in my view, wean people away from the whole idea of good and bad. And I usually tell the story here of the Chinese farmer, but you'll all know it, so perhaps I won't. But there is no such thing really. What is. There's whole philosophical issues depending on what belief system you subscribe to, but you have to wean people away from good and bad. There is a time for thinking, is it going to be painful or not? That's another question. So, responding to the question, what will happen? Well, it seems to me that one has to differentiate, as you'll see on the slide, one has to differentiate between collective and individual responsibility. And here you'll notice that I've put collective responsibility and events that have already happened. So if something's already happened, you'll see we cannot change the past. E.g., my purse has been stolen. Events, so the idea of, my purse has been stolen. Well, this is when you might go to a horary astrologer. You might say, oh, I've lost my purse, where is it? And a horary astrologer would set up a chart for the moment you ask the question and will probably or possibly be able to tell you where your purse is, what happened to it, whether you're going to get it back, and so on. So there the astrologer can predict. It's a particular type of astrology, a particular skill, not one that really interests me that much. And you can only do very simple questions, I think. But anyway, you can predict then. And then there's also all the events over which we have little say, little power, little control. So, the country that you live in going to war, the factory that you work at closing down, an earthquake. All of these things, the individual has very little power, or none, really. And in those situations, the astrologer should be able to predict. And should be able to. But most things that people bring, most things, are about individual responsibility. events over which the individual has a major responsibility for the outcome, as you see on the wall. Shall I get married? Shall I get divorced? Shall I change my job? Those kind of questions. These are the questions that people bring. And the astrologer, I would argue, shouldn't predict, but shouldn't be able to. And the reason being, well, let's just think, we're each of us, as I put here, responsible for ourselves. We're responsible for our successes, for our failures. We also have some responsibility, obviously, for what goes on around us, like global warming, for example. But one of the reasons that we shouldn't be able to predict is because we change things by looking at them. So client comes and has a natal Pluto in their 10th house, 10th house of career, and Saturn in the sky is conjunct with Pluto, or the opposite way round, it doesn't matter, something like that. And they go to the astrologer and they say, should I change my job? I'm having a hard time with my boss. My boss is controlling me. I have no freedom. I have no power. I feel so powerless. Now, it may be that there's things going on in the horoscope in terms of forecasting when you can say, yes, this is a fantastic time to change your job, or no. But what can be very fruitful is to say, have you felt like this before? So the 10th house is not only the house of career, it is also a parental house. And 9 times out of 10, your client will say, well, it's funny you should say that. It reminds me of when I was 5. My mother or father or somebody or other, ... And so you can have a conversation then with your client, showing that the situation now is actually quite similar to the one when they were 5. But the difference is they're not 5. When they were 5, they were completely powerless. Now they're not. So perhaps they are projecting the earlier situation onto the current situation. But also now it's an opportunity to deal with what they weren't able to deal with when they were 5. And it includes perhaps giving the boss less power and themselves more. It's about having a dialogue. Anyway, the particular conversation you would have with the client would vary according to the situation. But basically your client would leave having a different attitude, a different perspective. That's what I think we're trying to do. So you might not even answer the question, should you change your job? But you have, in some sense, empowered your client so they can look at the situation differently. So we change things by looking at them. And actually, this is a law of science, of scientific research. Any of you who are researchers will know that there is such a thing as experimenter bias and all sorts of different things. That, a lot of stuff that is proved by science isn't really, hasn't really been proved. So we change things by looking at them. So in some sense, that conversation, your client, their attitude has changed by doing that. And indeed, if you have a serious conversation with a friend, by what your friend says, they also can change your mind. It's looking at something changes it. So you're offered a real opportunity here. So in terms of what will happen, well, I'm still not answering that very well. But why is this happening? You can have a conversation. What might it mean? You can have a conversation. I'm not saying that us, the astrologer, will know the answers to that, but we have the language of the planets and signs and houses to help us with that dialogue. Because quite often we can use the words. We don't actually know what the client is experiencing, but if you keep to the language of the planets, you keep tightly to the language of the planets, you will find that the person thinks, my goodness, you've described exactly what I'm feeling. That's the way to work. So what is really going on? Yes. When will it happen? Well, that's to do with forecasting techniques, which we might talk about later. Where will it happen? Well, some of you will be familiar with the idea of relocation, so that you can get a map of the world with your planets rising and setting and on the MC and IC, and it will give you some idea where different things will happen. Or you can draw a horoscope for a particular place and see what the chart looks like. For example, a famous example is Margaret Thatcher, the ex-Prime Minister of the UK. She went to war with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. And actually, if you set up her chart as if she was born in the Falkland Islands, she has Mars, the god of war, exactly on the ascendant. Or you can relocate John F. Kennedy's chart to Dallas, where he was shot, and he has Pluto, the planet amongst other things we associate with death, exactly on the midheaven. When I say these planets are on these angles, I'm talking about quite precisely. And those of you who travel, you can play yourself with moving your horoscope to different places that you travel to. If you're going with other people, add all the charts together, and the composite chart, the chart of the added, move that to the place, and then you'll see why you're going to that particular place. So where will it happen? Forwards-wise, you can't really do that. It's more astrologer's fun, really. What it will feel like, you'll know what it feels like. We can describe that. So Saturn transits, we've discussed. We know you're going to feel old, things are going to be delayed, and so on. What to do next? Well, maybe. So how to use the given energies, how to use the given situation. So Saturn transits, you work. You get down to basics, you face realism, all the things we've discussed. So strategies about how to deal with things we can do. All right, I'm going to look at a chart here. And this is a chart of a woman whose husband died. Many women will have a husband died. One partner has to die before the other. But she was comparatively young. She was about 50. So I'm going to show you the transit and illustrate the importance of the semi-square and sesquiquadrate aspect. But the first thing to say is that the horoscope as a map of potential leads to a further point, that nothing can happen if you do not have the potential for it in your horoscope. So if you don't have the potential to grow into an oak tree, you're not going to. So looking at this woman, the question is, does she have the potential to be widowed early on? If she's 85, it doesn't count. Everybody has the potential for that if they're married. So I'm going to take some of the chart away. So here, I just want you to notice that she has Venus, square Saturn, tightly. Venus is in the marriage box, 7th house. It's in Saturn's sign, Capricorn, and it squares Saturn, and Saturn is the ruler of the 7th house. So this is what you're always looking for in forecasting, as in natal work. You're looking for something that is written at least 3 times. And here it is written. So it's Venus, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, Venus, Saturn, really. So for me, that definitely has the potential for, if you like, time-limited love. And Saturn is the other planet we associate with death. In fact, Pluto, Saturn and Chiron. So the potential is there. So what happened was her husband went on a business trip, had a heart attack, and that was it. So if you look at the arrows in blue, you will see that Pluto is actually semi-square her sun, okay, where it says transit re-husband. So the Pluto in the 5th house is semi-square her sun in Capricorn, so death of a man, death of a husband. The Pluto is also sesquiquadrate Jupiter. She has Sun squared Jupiter exactly in his chart, in her chart. So the Sun squared Jupiter, I'm just going to go back to the slide before, you can see the Sun squared Jupiter there. In fact, I've got a slight, there's a slight difference in time, but don't worry, the same thing counts really. She's got Sun squared Jupiter. And her husband was a businessman who overworked, Sun in the 6th house, squared Jupiter. He was very ambitious. I suspect that she was ambitious for him and was part of his ambition and doing too much. Anyway, so Pluto semi-square the Sun, Pluto sesquiquadrate the Jupiter. It clearly shows the potential for the death of the husband. And then you look at transiting Saturn, in the sort of pinky arrow, transiting Saturn is conjunct the Venus and squaring itself. So the transiting Saturn is just triggering what we saw in the natal chart. Now, so if I saw this, I would have a vague idea that maybe, I wouldn't feel that her husband was completely safe. Now, what you can see here is that we're looking at her chart. We haven't looked at the husband's chart. Indeed, I don't have his birth details. And it's easier quite often to predict other people's fate in your chart than it is your fate, because in some sense, one's having a conversation with you and free will's being changed. The free will is not being changed in his chart. We're not having the conversation with him. So prediction is easier when one's looking at the client's mother, father, children, dog, parents, whatever. It is written. So the thing to always remember is that none of us are an island. You need to look at a few charts. Now, of course, you might have had a conversation here about her husband perhaps overdoing things. In some sense, in this case, although it is her husband that has died, I suspect that psychologically it is her father. Saturn, planet of the father, Capricorn, sign of the father. So psychologically, it's death of the father. So if you were having a conversation with her beforehand, I think the conversation I might have is just about her marriage and in what sense she's married her father and whether she wants to have a shift on that in some way. Anyway, the other important thing I want to say is that nothing will come to pass if, as I said before, the potential for it isn't shown in your natal chart. So if there is no potential in your chart for winning 5 million pounds, euros, yen, whatever, if there is not that potential in your chart, it doesn't matter what transit you have, you're not going to win that huge amount of money. On the other hand, if it's a small amount of money, well then most of us have the potential for that. So on that note, we'll finish this film. Goodbye and thanks for watching.